There are some more seats up front here.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, please make your way up front if you'd like to sit a little bit closer. We don't bite in the front. Please don't be shy. My name is Dave Reist, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute. On behalf of Mr. Mike Swetnam, our CEO, and General Gray, the 29th Commandant of Marine Corps, the chairman of our Board of Regents, who just walked in the back, sir, good to have you here today. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. This distinguished panel, you came to listen to them, but as I looked at this topic, I thought to myself, what if you put a Rubik's Cube in the middle of the room right now? And all the sides of the Rubik's Cube, before it's all messed up, all are a single color. So when you look at the cube from your side of the room, you're seeing yellow. When I look at the Rubik's Cube from my side, I'm seeing blue. We are looking at the exact same cube. We could describe it as a cube. The colors of the sides are different. It's perspective. Today is perspective, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, Dr. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John Lewis, for your opening remarks. And I'm going to be brief. First of all, would you kindly turn off all the cell phones? I did it, but maybe it's going to work. I don't know. I don't know. Now, okay. There are some more seats here, Bill. First of all, I would like to certainly welcome our distinguished panelists, all of whom have made extraordinary contributions to legal scholarship, both in times of war and times of peace. And each of the speakers contributed a chapter in this outstanding volume, this book. We'll talk more about this, dealing with some of the legal issues in the struggle against terrorism. And Professor Bob Turner right here is the co-editor, together with his colleague, John Norton Moore, who is away out of the country, I understand. Now he's going to talk more about that. And this volume was published by Carolina Academic Press last year. There are flyers in your package there, and some books are available if you would like to order some. Now, very soon, very shortly, I will introduce the panel and invite them to provide some very unique insights into some of the complicated legal issues surrounding the assassination of Ben Laden last May in Pakistan. And as I said, many of the issues are discussed already in the book. But before, if I may, before we proceed with our panel discussion, there are several brief academic and logistical matters that are in order. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation, the appreciation of the Potomac Institute to the co-sponsors of this event. First, to our colleague, I mentioned his name, Bob Turner, the Center for National Security Law of the University of Virginia School of Law, and to Professor Jeffrey Addicott, Director of the Center of Terrorism Law at St. Mary University School of Law and in Texas, and then, of course, our colleagues at the International Law Institute. First, before we continue, I would like to introduce General Gray right here, who's going to take over, I'm sure.
No. Keep going.
But seriously, I mean,
If they're any good, I'll comment at the end.
you honored us by coming, and I'm sure that you can provide some wise guidance to our discussion, so I better sit down and keep quiet. But at any rate, before that, I would like to introduce also, in addition to General Gray, two vice presidents, I think. Tom O'Leary, supposed to be here. I don't see him. And Gail Clifford. Gail, where are you? Okay. Now, in addition to that, obviously, I would like to introduce particularly Professor Jim Giordano, who is the Vice President for Academic Affairs right here at the Potomac Institute, is also the Director of the Center right here at the Potomac of Neurotechnology, and as well as Executive Editor of the new Potomac Institute Press. I would like to also introduce Sherry Lovelace. Come up front so they can see you, who is the Managing Editor of the press. And I ask Jim to speak briefly. You can speak as long as you want, but you have to finish in 3 minutes about the press or anything you want.
Sure, thank you.
Not assassination.
I promise I won't. Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander, and thank to each and all of you for attending this event and all of our events here at the Potomac Institute. As Dr. Alexander mentioned, my name is Professor Jim Giordano, and I'm the Director of the Potomac Institute Press and also Vice President for Academic Programs. As you may know, here at the Potomac Institute, we have a number of ongoing academic issues, programs, and foci, and among them are the work of our three principal centers. Certainly the International Center for Terrorism Studies is one that leads the field, both nationally and internationally, in looking at those academic issues that arise in and from the prosecution, detention, and work with counter-terrorist groups and terrorists. Of course, the situation that we have here today that has been described and why you're all here. We also have the Center for Neurotechnology Studies that works in conjunction with the ICTS to determine those ways that current neuroscience and neurotechnology may be used not only in medicine and public life, but also as a venue for national security, intelligence, and defense. And our third center is the Consortium for Integrative Scientific Technologies and Convergences that looks at the way genoscience, nanoscience, neuroscience, and increasingly cyber science are used in each and all of these endeavors. And that brings together our work here, together with the University of Pittsburgh, Norwich University, Advanced Research Institute, increasingly the University of New Mexico, and the National Defense University. The focus is simple: to be able to ground the issues that face our contemporary world with those academic loci and foci that are necessary to a full three-dimensional understanding of the problems and their potential resolutions. Certainly, Dr. Alexander's ongoing programs have been paramount in leading the field for terrorism and counterterrorism studies, and I thank each and all of you for your ongoing support. But what becomes important is not just a discourse such as this that provides an exchange of ideas, but to utilize discourses such as this for an ongoing platform, nexus, and vector for continuing an ongoing dialectic both nationally and internationally. And towards that end, the Potomac Institute Press is dedicated toward assimilating scholarly work in a variety of areas: science and technology, environmental policy, and of course, terrorism and counterterrorism studies. Arising from that has been the launch of our new terrorism monograph series, which I'm proud to say is edited by Dr. Alexander. The series brings together the work of his ongoing seminars and symposia over the past year and forthcoming symposia as part of a concentrated body of literature that provides for each and all of you, as well as our colleagues internationally, a view into the cutting edge of terrorism and counterterrorism studies, so is able to ground us both to academic realities and future speculation. One of the things that we were very proud to do, if I could, is to begin the launch of this series with our first monograph: Perspectives on the Detention, Prosecution, and Punishment of Terrorists, Implications for Future Conduct and Policy. The book was edited by Dr. Yona Alexander, Don Wallace, and the late Edgar Brenner. And I'm proud to say that Edgar Brenner's widow. Mrs. Brenner is here with us today, and what we'd like to do at this time is to just bring Dr. Alexander up and present the first copy of this book, literally hot off the press, arrived yesterday, to Mrs. Brenner. This book will be available to you via Amazon, and copies will be available for sale via cash or credit card after this event. We have a limited number of pre-production copies that are available here, and again, it will be available on Amazon and through the Potomac Institute Press hereafter. If I could, Dr. Alexander.
Thank you very much, Jim and Sherry, for really caring and doing a superb professional job to
Thank you.
publish it, and the editing and so on, and making it on time. It's a true mission. Mrs. Brenner, Janet Brenner, who is, by the way, a graduate of George Washington University Law School, and she's a member of the bar, the team. And I have mixed feelings, obviously, as you know. I mean, on the one hand, I miss Ed, who made so many contributions to scholarship for the past 30 years that we worked together. We're going to have a special memorial to celebrate his many contributions at the International Law Institute on July 7th. And at this time, I would like to present you the first copy.
Very proud.
It's an historic copy of the study that we worked on and tragically died before we had a chance to see this printed. So
Thank
this
you
is
so
for you.
much.
It's a great honor. By the way, we're going to have a follow-up of the discussion of today on terrorism and civil liberties, security versus rights. And I'm delighted that our colleague right here, Professor Bob Turner, and the center at Charlottesville is going to co-sponsor and so forth. So you have the information about the coming events. Now, I'm moving on to introduce the panel, but not so quickly, because I have two academic footnotes, one historical and one contemporary, that I would like to offer, because they are related one way or another to our discussion today. I would like to recall a statement, observation made by Cicero, and he said that in times of war, the law falls silent. In times of war, the law falls silent. Well, if it's true or not, we are going to discuss it. Secondly, I would like to mention specifically that today, exactly on June 28, 1914, close to 100 years ago, the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo. And as you know, this was one of the contributing factors that actually triggered the First World War. The point I'm trying to make is that when we're going to deal with assassination as a framework, we have to deal with assassination from below and from above. Finally, I would like to share with you a letter which I received some 27 years ago by a very distinguished American senator who actually was a candidate for the presidency of the United States. And he said, and I quote, "The subject of terrorism is a subject that, frankly, we don't know enough about to even begin talking about legislation." And then he continues, and I quote, "The only approach to terrorism, in my view, is to use strong, almost terrorist-type tactics against those who initiate such action. And this in itself is not acceptable to the average American. So frankly, just between you and me, I don't know what can be done about it at this time. But we must continue thinking about it and working to resolve the problem, unquote. The senator was Barry Goldwater, and we still have to deal with that issue. Incidentally, in the website of the Al-Qaeda, one of their websites, there is a laundry list of targets of Americans from the Rand Corporation, think tanks, and others. In other words, they are marked people. The question is, how can we respond to that? Fortunately, we have a very distinguished panel. And just for procedural arrangements, I would like to mention that I have to keep the time. I'm the timekeeper. If the speaker, you have each one 15 minutes. Bob, if you or the others go over above that, I'm going to show this to you, which means you have 2 minutes. If you continue, I will show you the right to stop. So beware, beware,
Like his sucker.
beware. Now, seriously, again, we can spend an hour just to relate what each and every one contributed to national global security concerns. I'm not going to do that because you do have the bios. I would like rather to have them speak, then to develop some discussion, and hopefully General Gray would also educate us. Now, the first speaker, I'm going to introduce them now, and I think the first speaker is going to be Professor Robert Turner. Is the co-founder and associate director of the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia School of Law and former chairman of the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security. The next speaker is going to be Spike Bowman, who is known here because he spoke at our events before. He's a former Deputy General Counsel, National Security of the FBI, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for National Security Law. The third speaker, Bob, we decided to have, I think, A. Sparks, and is a former Senior Associate Deputy General Counsel, International Affairs Division, the Department of Defense, and last but not least, Professor Jeffrey Addicott, who is Director of the Center for Terrorism Law at the St. Mary University School of Law, a Distinguished Professor of Law at the St. Mary University School of Law, and former Senior Legal Advisor, U.S. Army Special Forces. Bob, it's all yours.
Can I make a request that you give me a yellow card when I've still got 3 minutes left on my 15?
You have 3 minutes.
Justice Holmes was said to have been able to stop speakers in the middle of the word if. I don't promise to match that, but I will, there we go. I will try hard to keep it under 15 minutes. General Gray, it's a great pleasure to see you again. I've known you since 1983. Yeah, and
23 October.
I was surprised to see him move up to 4-star rank because I thought he was too able and too honest and too candid and not really politically correct enough. And it turned out the Marine Corps and some of our leaders were wiser than I knew. He was 4-star material. The question was, would our leaders be willing to reward the kind of courage and independence that he had shown? And he's a great American. General Rist, and of course Yona, my old friend, great pleasure to be here. Now, there was 5 of my minutes. Let's see what we can do next. We killed bin Laden, and as soon as we did, some people started saying, oh, that's not fair. This was an extrajudicial execution, murder, killing, was an assassination in violation of the Executive Order 12333. It's not fair play, and so forth. And so we put together a panel of truly distinguished people. Hayes Parks is the leading authority on the law of armed conflict in America today. I don't have any question about that. When Howard Levy died at the age of 101, was it? There might have been some debate because Howard trained Hayes, but at this point I think Hayes is the man. Spike Bowman, after a distinguished career in the Navy, was the top national security lawyer at the FBI for many years, and just number one in terms of knowing that. And Jeff Addicott, of course, is an old dear friend and runs the, I think, the only law school center dealing directly with terrorism law. Now, I'm going to briefly address two issues. Are we engaged in an armed conflict, or is this pure law enforcement? And the second one, was bin Laden assassinated in violation of Executive Order 12333? The first one is a fairly easy one to do. I actually made these slides originally when I was doing a debate at Columbia Law School about the legality of targeting al-Awlaki, an American citizen, and I was debating an ACLU spokesman who was involved in the case, and I put the authorities that I'm going to show you on one side of the scale, and I put al-Awlaki's father and the ACLU on the other side, and amazingly, the scale tipped to one way. Who makes the decision of whether we're involved in an armed conflict? Well, did the UN Security Council have something to do with it? Probably not, but still, they're not unimportant. NATO, Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, doesn't matter. They all say this is an armed conflict. The Security Council recognized it as an armed conflict the day after the 9/11 attacks. In Resolution 1368, it expressed the determination of the world community to combat by all means the threats posed by terrorist acts and recognize, quote, the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense in accordance with the Charter. Now, what does the Charter actually tell us about individual and collective self-defense? Article 51 says nothing in the Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. This is the law of armed conflict, not the law of law enforcement. Later that month, in Resolution 1373, again, it said the 9/11 attacks constitute a threat to international peace and security and reaffirm the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense. After September 12th, the North Atlantic Council, also on September 12th, the day after the attacks, the North Atlantic Council formally invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter for the first time in its history, again using the language armed attack. The United States Congress has overwhelmingly authorized the use of military force pursuant to the War Powers Resolution. Section 2 says the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, or committed to terrorist attacks. The combined vote was 518 to 1, a very close congressional vote on this. Both President Bush and Obama have recognized we're at war. President Bush, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, said our enemies have committed an act of war. President Obama, January 7th, 2010, we are at war. The Supreme Court in Hamdan and other cases has acknowledged the detention issues are judged by the law of war or law of armed conflict. State Department legal advisor and former dean of Yale Law School and a dear friend and debate opponent of mine going back decades has also joined in. And Harold is one of the most liberal, how do I describe this? Well, let's just say no one would confuse him with a hardliner. In this ongoing armed conflict, the U.S. has the authority under international law to use force, including lethal force, including targeting persons such as high-level al-Qaeda leaders, of which one might note Osama bin Laden qualified, or as which. He told the American Society of International Law, some have suggested that targeting a particular leader violates the laws of war, but individuals who are part of such an armed group are belligerents and therefore lawful targets. Some have argued the use of lethal force against specific individuals fails to provide adequate process and is an extrajudicial killing. But a state that is engaged in an armed conflict or in legitimate self-defense is not required to provide targets with legal process before they may be killed. That's a photo going back to 1990 when Dean Coe and I were on Crossfire together fighting on the assassination issue, ironically. But anyway, on this one we're in agreement. Now let's just briefly turn to the issue of assassination. Shortly after Secretary of Defense Cheney announced that, or fired the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Dugan, because Dugan had said publicly that if Saddam does not withdraw before the January 15th deadline, and we have to use force, we're going to personally target him and kill him. And sadly, he went on to say, and kill his family and so forth, which of course is not a legitimate target. But Secretary Cheney fired him and said, we do not do assassinations. And that concerned me in part because I believe in incentives, and I thought we were sending exactly the wrong message to Saddam. If we tell Saddam, you can go ahead and commit aggression and the only price is going to be paid by the children of your subjects, he's going to commit aggression. If you tell him, hey, if you commit aggression, you might have some personal discomfort when it's all over, maybe we can deter him. So I did a piece that was run as the lead article in the Washington Post Outlook section, October 7th, 1990, called Killing Saddam, Would It Be a Crime? And I argued he was a perfectly lawful target. There is no sovereign immunity protecting heads of state. You know, Nuremberg establishes that. He's not protected by any rule of international law that protects Red Cross or hospital workers. He was a lawful target. And indeed, I was pleased a few months after the operation was over, Bill Webster, the head of the CIA, came up to me at an ABA breakfast and said, Bob, you can be sure if we could have found him, we'd have taken him out in an instant. Now, for the record, on the assassination issue, at the far end of the table here is Hayes Parks, who in November of 1989, before I first raised this issue to a broader public, wrote an excellent legal memo of law for the Department of the Army, in which he also took the view that the prohibition against assassination in Executive Order 12333 does not prohibit the killing of enemy leaders or specific individuals during an armed conflict. Now, Executive Order 12333, actually picking up language that was contained in earlier orders by Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford, Section 211, prohibition on assassination. No person employed or acting on behalf of the U.S. government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination, which was not defined. Interestingly, when this first came out, and for the next almost 3 years, I was the counsel to the President's Intelligence Oversight Board in the White House, so it was my job to make sure nobody was violating any provision of that order, and thus I gave some thought to this issue at the time, and it was my view that any lawful act of self-defense or lawful act of force in armed conflict does not apply. And the reason is simple. It's a matter of definition. What is assassination? Well, this is a little bit old. They're newer editions, but when I first produced this in 1990, Black's Law Dictionary said assassination was murder committed for hire, a murder committed treacherously or by stealth or surprise or by lying in wait. But the key word, murder, murder. The Oxford Companion to the Law, the murder of a person by lying in wait for him and then killing him or her, particularly the murder of prominent people for political motives, such as the assassination of President Kennedy. Again, murder is an unprivileged killing. Self-defense is a privileged killing. Killing an armed, there's a combatant's privilege in armed conflict that makes the act not murder or not wrongful in any other sense. Thus, killing Osama bin Laden was not assassination, did not violate the prohibition against assassination contained in 12333. During the American Revolution, we intentionally targeted British officers and Indian guides. Those weren't assassinations. We were involved in an armed conflict. On April 18, 1943, President Roosevelt authorized the sending of 18 P-38 naval aircraft to intercept an aircraft. We had broken the Japanese codes, and we knew that Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor and the head of the Japanese Navy, was going to be flying in this military transport plane. It was not an armed, a warplane in any real sense. And the instructions were find the plane and shoot it down. The goal was to kill Admiral Yamamoto. It was not an illegal act, it was not a war crime, and it was not an assassination or a murder. It was a lawful act of use of force in armed conflict. In 1998, I had the great privilege of writing an op-ed in USA Today. The title was, "In Self-Defense, U.S. has a right to kill terrorist bin Laden." My argument was this man is engaged in a series of armed attacks against the United States. We have a right under the law of self-defense. I'm not talking about armed conflict. I'm talking about just pure self-defense, to kill him wherever we can find him, because this is an ongoing series of attacks, and we don't have the option of arresting him for something like that. How are we coming on time? You're about ready to give me a red card or the yellow card? That's perfect. Bin Laden was a lawful target in '98 when I wrote that, and he was certainly a lawful target on May 2nd, 2010. And I kept to my yellow card time, and I will await questions after the next speaker.
You're a true gentleman and scholar.
And punctual, too.
Okay, thank you. Spike, take over.
Well, I'm under absolutely no illusions as to my role here, because everybody else is going to be talking about the law of armed conflict, and I'm going to be talking about the role of law enforcement in an armed conflict. The fact that an armed conflict exists does not mean that there is no role for law enforcement. And in fact, almost from day one in both Afghanistan and Iraq, there have been FBI agents on the ground working as supporting forces for the military. If the operation against bin Laden, however, had been a law enforcement mission, things would look very different than they do today. Had that been a law enforcement mission, the FBI would have been a supported organization. It could not have gone into Pakistan alone. It would have had to have military support, and military support would have had to be supporting law enforcement objectives. Now, what would those objectives be? If the FBI had been tasked with going after bin Laden, their duty would have been to apprehend if possible. Their rules of engagement would not have changed from what they are on the ground in the United States, or in fact as they are on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan today. They're, as a supporting force in Iraq and Afghanistan, their rules of engagement remain that they can use deadly force only in self-defense or to protect someone else from being harmed. Had this been an operation, a law enforcement operation, the FBI would have been supported. They would have been taken into the target area. Their duty would have been to try to apprehend. They would have used a deadly force only as a last resort, and the rules of engagement between the military and the FBI would probably have been quite different between the two of them. However, as the supported force, the military would have been hampered by the fact that the law enforcement organization had the primary mission. And Yoni, you're not going to have a chance to get after a yellow card with me because that's basically all I'm going to talk about at this point in time, because I think it's more important to hear the law of armed conflict portions of this, and then we'll factor in the law enforcement issues as people have questions for me.
Thank you very much.
I have to start by saying that 25 years ago, I was a young colonel out of Coronado, California, when General Gray stood up and said, "I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. 2 hours later, he said, "You tiny battered colonels, just sit still, I'm not through yet." But that was without a single note. It was one of the most impressive presentations I've ever heard. And it was on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So, sir, we're still there. I'm going to start off by saying I do agree with everything Bob Goldman said about we are in an armed conflict. We and our allies, I'm going to stress that. This has not just been the U.S.-only type of affair. And as a result, the law of war does apply. We refer to the law of war as something that's lex specialis, that it is unique to these circumstances, and it does apply in any type of an armed conflict. When you talk about the law of war, people oftentimes think, well, it ties our hands, it restricts us. In fact, the law of war does create legal obligations, but it also gives us a number of significant legal rights. Some of those are what we refer to as the combatant's privilege. Uniformed members of the military of a nation are combatants. As such, they may engage in combat operations, including attack of enemy combatants. A combatant himself or herself is also subject to attack at all times or places, whatever activity in which he or he is engaged, whether armed or unarmed, regardless of proximity to combat operations. As a combatant, there is no obligation to provide the enemy combatant the opportunity to surrender before attacking them. and any attempt to surrender is subject to a reasonable ability to accept that surrender. In contrast, the civilians, as a two-way street here, civilians are protected from intentional attack so long as they are not taking a direct part in hostilities. Those are some key words here. If a civilian does engage in taking direct part in hostilities, they lose that immunity from direct attack. They do not gain the combatant's privilege, but they can be attacked themselves. The phrase direct participation in hostilities exists in a treaty. It's a 1977 formulation, but it doesn't have any further definition in it. So as a result, from 2004 to 2008, the TMC Asser Institute of the Netherlands and the International Committee of the Red Cross called together approximately 40 experts to discuss this issue and frame definitions of it. I was one of those participants. We didn't agree on everything. We could not get consensus on many things. But one thing we did agree on, that the leader of something like a terrorist organization or any type of a dissident armed forces was in fact taking a direct part in hostilities and was subject to attack. Looking at that and looking at the actions of Osama bin Laden over the last number of years, 1993 I believe was the first attack, has directed multiple attacks against the United States and other nations. And as a leader of Al-Qaeda, provided continuous strategic direction. Materials captured during the raid on his home confirmed his continuous leadership role. Therefore, and I agree again with Harold Coe in his statement, which by the way was thoroughly coordinated with the Department of Defense, the Department of State, well obviously he worked there, was the boss, the CIA and the Department of Justice. I do agree with the conclusion that Osama bin Laden was a lawful target and under the law of war. Now, let's move forward a little bit to explain how these missions occur. There are any number of historic capture or kill types of missions that have gone on through the years. One was not successful, and there's many that are not successful, as there are those that are successful. One unsuccessful mission like this was by number 11 Scottish Commando into Velatoria, Libya on November 16, 1941 to capture or kill German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was not there. In September 1942, the British were concerned that General Fazlollah Zahedi, commanding Persian forces in southern Persia, was a German collaborator. Special Operations Forces were assigned the mission to capture or kill Zahedi. He was captured by Captain, later Brigadier Fitzroy McLean, Special Air Services, 2 other SAS, and a company of Seaforth Highlanders. In Operation Just Cause, our Special Operations Forces Special Mission Units were assigned the role of trying to capture Manuel Noriega. Took him a while, but after about 2.5 weeks, he was in fact captured. We had some other non-armed conflict situations that arose as well, and this gets a little bit into Spike's issue as well. On December 14, 1995, the Dayton Accords were signed in Paris. This ended the fighting in the Balkans. UN Security Council Resolution 1031 gave NATO mandate to implement military aspects thereof. One of these missions included support to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, in The Hague. One of the missions given was location and capture of persons indicted for war crimes for delivery to ICTY authorities, the PICWICs as we call them. The capture or kill missions were executed by NATO SOF from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. In that process, 23 were in fact captured and detained and sent to The Hague for trial, and 2 were killed while they were resisting capture. I bring this up here because we are talking the law of armed conflict, but at the same time, there is this trade-off or relationship with law enforcement too. But it goes back to what Spike said. You may attempt to capture in a law enforcement type operation like this, although arguably these were military operations. But at the same time, you do still have the inherent right of self-defense and can use deadly force if someone resists. Going back to an armed conflict environment, Saddam Hussein was captured on December 13, 2003. The rules of engagement given to the special mission unit that went out to capture him were provided an emphasis on capture. At the same time, it was entirely the discretion of the mission team leader as to whether or not deadly force would be applied if he resisted capture.
In fact, he was down in his hidey hole when he was found. He was encouraged to come out. He didn't come out. He was informed that a grenade was about to be popped in his hole, hidey hole, and he suddenly decided maybe it was the right thing to do. But through all this, you can see the discretion remained with the individual in charge on the ground at that time. In contrast, in another situation, we identified and located Al-Qaeda and Iraq chief Mossab al-Zarqawi on June 7, 2006. Rather than get into a horrendous firefight trying to capture him, an F-16 was on station, was directed in and dropped two 500-pound laser-guided bombs on him to kill him. In the course of the armed conflict in Iraq, U.S. and British special forces, special mission units engaged in specific counterterrorism operations in Iraq. In those operations, our special mission units, that is the U.S., engaged 11,000 to 12,000 members of terrorist organizations. The majority of them were captured. In contrast, the British captured or killed 3,500, 90% of whom were captured. There was a distinction in the percentages there between the U.S. and the British for a number of reasons, including areas of operations, enemy forces each targeted and faced, and tactical differences in approach. Toward the conclusion of the UK SOF operations on May 30th, 2009, the British commanders had adopted much of the same U.S. approach. So, we now get down to this particular mission. We've identified where UBL is, and the decision goes to what means may we use. We could use some sort of bomber aircraft delivering precision-guided munitions. Then you get into issues of collateral damage to innocent civilians. We could have used a sniper from 800 meters if he ever showed us way out, or even a greater distance. Or we could have used special operations forces, which was the deciding factor. The point here is proximity to the target does not change the right to engage that person with deadly force. We don't go to a law enforcement situation simply because we now have the target at close hand. There were a number of questions raised afterwards about, well, gee, but he was unarmed. The individual who entered, the individual SEAL who entered that room did not know he was unarmed. In fact, there were two weapons in the room. Every time he had been seen with an AK close at hand. So it was reasonable and right for that individual SEAL going in there to not wait and say, excuse me, could we talk about this a little bit, or why can't we just get along or something? But in fact, he had the right to engage him at that point. This, I will tell you, is also consistent, very consistent, with our own domestic law, which points out the test of reasonableness is not capable of a precise definition or mechanical application. And similarly, facts that are not known to the officer or individual at the time are not relevant to the case. How am I doing on time?
You're doing fine.
All right, I have one other point I want to raise, just to toss it out there, because I think it's one that sort of hung around this for a while. On May 26, 2011, Vice President Biden asserted that President Obama's decision to send U.S. Special Operations Forces to capture or kill Osama bin Laden was, quote, the boldest undertaking any president has taken in modern history. I think that history is kind of modern history is kind of a range there, but I would say I'm not so sure about that. Let's look first at the April 18th, 1942 Doolittle air raid into Tokyo at the start of World War II, into sending a carrier into deeply protected Japanese waters. That was probably a little more dicey, I would say. The November 20th, 1970 raid deep into North Vietnam by U.S. Special Operations Forces who landed at the Son Tay prisoner of war camp to try to rescue the prisoners who unfortunately had been evacuated from there just a few weeks beforehand. Certainly the equally high risk but also unsuccessful mission of April 24th, 25th, 1980 by U.S. Special Operations Forces intended to penetrate into Tehran to rescue U.S. diplomats held hostage since November 4th, 1979 by the governor of Iran was certainly a higher risk than the mission that was carried out on May 1st. I can go on with a lot more of those, including those from other countries, such as the famous Israeli raid on Entebbe on July 4th, 1976. But the point is, these are high-risk missions for the people on the ground. the risk to the national, to the nation and its leaders is probably not quite as much as was suggested by Vice President Biden. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm reminded of the novelist Rebecca West. She said the trouble with man is two things. He cannot learn those truths that are too complicated, and he forgets those truths that are too simple. Why do we really have this debate today? Why is there such confusion in the United States and around the world about whether the killing of Osama bin Laden was legal or not? It's primarily because we've never done anything like this. And what is this? Well, 9/11, the president decided that we were at war. The war on terror, lousy term because terrorism is a tactic, but it's kind of sexy. It meets the military acronym of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. But President Obama had a better term in January when he said we're at war against Al-Qaeda. So I recently had the privilege of debating the president of the ACLU, Susan Harman, a professor up north. That must mean I'm the most conservative law professor in the country. And basically at the debate we had the same thing. And I said, look, if we're not in a state of war, we've done a lot of illegal stuff in the last 10 years. We've detained people indefinitely without charging with a crime, both in Guantanamo Bay and Bagram Air Force Base. We've killed lots of people. President Obama has killed by drone hundreds of people without any due process at all. We have conducted military commissions against many, many people, and the Obama administration has restarted the military commission process. So if we're not in a state of war, real war, not a metaphor, then she wins the debate. We've done a lot of illegal stuff, because under domestic criminal law, you can't do these things. But if we're at war, they're perfectly lawful. So we have to understand that concept, first of all. So who tells us if we're at war? Is it going to be Keith Olbermann? Is it going to be the New York Times? Is it going to be a pointy-headed law professor somewhere? No. It's going to come from our three branches of government. And if you set that premise, that's where you go from. So does the executive branch believe that we're at war? As Professor Turner indicated, the answer is yes. President Bush on 9/11 said this is a war. And I'm not talking about a metaphor. This is a war. Now, I'm originally from Alabama, but I had a news reporter come up to me right after 9/11. They said, do you think President Bush will do anything? And I looked at the reporter and I just said, he's a Texan. Now, fortunately, our president was from Texas at that time, because if I said he's, from Illinois, they would say, what does that mean? So President Bush acted under Article 2 and said, yeah, we're at war. I'm using the law of war. And President Bush did the right things. He went to Congress. He also went to the Security Council. He went to NATO and got support for that thrust. What about Congress? Well, what about President Obama? President Obama doesn't say it very often, obviously. In fact, when he took office, you could tell he was very uncomfortable with this war thing against the Al-Qaeda network. His first executive orders, I'm going to close Guantanamo Bay. No, you're not. I'm going to stop military commission. No, you're not. In fact, if he was really in the mindset of being at war, you would say, I'm building another wing onto Guantanamo Bay, because by saying you're going to close Guantanamo Bay, what are we apologizing for, again, Mr. President? Because the indication is we did something wrong. Well, what did we do wrong? Didn't they incinerate 3,000 people on 9/11? Aren't we under the law of war? Don't we have the right to detain them indefinitely? The answer to those questions is yes, 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 yes. But there's two things your mama tells you to never talk about in polite company. Of course, religion and politics plays a role in this stuff. But the president came around, and by the time Abu Mutalib tried to blow himself up over Detroit, he finally got on the air and said, we are at war against Al-Qaeda. I like his term better. In fact, in a law review article, I'd encouraged him to use that term, because the war on terror is a lousy term, because it doesn't define who the enemy is. War on terror, it tells you we're at war, which is an important criteria, because you let people know we're acting under the law of war, and then it tells you who the enemy is. I love it. War against Al-Qaeda. He's never said it since. But he acts as a commander-in-chief as if we're at war, because under his authority, he's detaining people, he's killing people, and he uses, when he goes to court, the law of war as his argument to do these things. And there's numerous court cases where the Obama administration has done that. So both executives believe that we're at war. What about the Congress? I've heard many, many people say, well, Congress didn't declare war, therefore we're not at war. Not real scholars of American history, are you? How many times has Congress declared war in about 170 wars that we've been in our history? And we're a very warlike people, which is good. I mean, if you're going to be a free people, you better be warlike. There's a lot of nations that want to destroy us over time. So how many wars have Congress declared war? Because they have the authority under Article 1. They've only declared war in 5 wars. By that logic, all the other wars are illegal, including the Korean War, the Gulf War, the Grenada campaign, and the Vietnam War. No, Congress, what they do is they pass authorizations for use of military force, and as Professor Turner indicated, that's what Congress did this time. Now here's the rub. The law of war basically was written when one nation goes to war against another nation. What's the problem? Al-Qaeda is not a nation state. They don't have a little card at the UN that says Al-Qaeda. And therefore, that caused a lot of legal scholars to scratch their head and said, wow, what are we doing? I was a military officer for 20 years as a senior legal advisor to the Green Berets, had a lot of fun doing that. I came on the faculty in 2000. After the 9/11 incident, I went to the dean and said, there's going to be a lot of new legal issues popping up because we've never done this stuff before, and that's why we formed our Center for Terrorism Law in Texas there. And that's really the rub. I mean, we've never made war against, as the authorization for use of military force says, against any nation, organization, or person. We made war against a person before? I mean, many people said, well, the law of war wasn't really meant to fight a virtual state. And Al-Qaeda basically is a virtual state. They have a lot of attributes of a nation state, and they have the goal of a nation state at war. If you have an Al-Qaeda member on this panel and said, you know, what do y'all want? What's the plural of y'all?
All y'all.
Good, I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that. I go up north, nobody says, what? Yeah, all y'all. What do y'all want? You want some land? You want some money? What do you want? And their answer is, we want to kill you. No, really, what do you want? No, really, that's our negotiating position. And by the way, they've killed more Muslims than they've killed Christians or Jews. Their goal is to conquer the world. You say, well, that's silly. They don't think it's silly. And they would kill you in a New York minute. They don't care if you're left, right, center. If you don't think like they think, they're at war with you, and they're very patient. So that's their goal. And so we're using the law of war, although it doesn't exactly fit, because that's all we've got. It's not domestic criminal law. It's too big. Now, before 9/11, we used domestic criminal law against Al-Qaeda in the federal court system. In fact, we use domestic criminal law against a lot of jihadists in this country that are not members of Al-Qaeda. If you're not a member of Al-Qaeda, we have to use domestic criminal law. And there are hundreds of jihadists that we prosecute in federal courts because they don't qualify. They only qualify if the president determines that they are basically unlawful enemy combatants. He can detain them indefinitely if he makes that determination, or kill them. In the case of Osama bin Laden, even Helen Keller could figure out that this guy is an unlawful enemy combatant. And Congress passed 2 Military Commissions Act, remember, 2006, where they said you can use military commissions against any member of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, or associated forces. So they named who the enemy is, which is very helpful. And of course, the Democrat-controlled Congress, because it won't do to have Republican-controlled Congress do this. In 2009, they passed their Military Commissions Act. They changed the name to, anybody know what the new name is now? Unlawful enemy belligerents. I still like illegal enemy belligerents, I'm sorry. I still like unlawful enemy combatants. My point is, you can't have military commissions unless you're at what? War. Right. So Congress must believe that we're at war. So they passed the authorization for use of military force. They passed the Military Commissions Act. Yes, they believe that we're at war. They don't have to declare war. In fact, Congress rarely does. The last branch of the government, the Supreme Court. I got a phone call from a reporter in 2004 from Chicago. Said this is a great defeat for the Bush administration. The issue before the court, plurality opinion 8-1. O'Connor wrote it. Hamdi, excuse me. They said, does the president have the authority to designate Hamdi, who is a U.S. citizen, as an enemy combatant and hold him indefinitely till the war is over? And the court issued its opinion, and I told the reporter, I said, just read this part of the opinion. I want you to read this with me slowly. The fact that we're at war, comma, so just let that part soak in. The Supreme Court has always recognized that this is a real war or armed conflict. Then it said, doesn't give the president a blank check to do whatever he wants to do, and the court said we want another set of eyes to check the math to make sure if the president says you're an unlawful enemy combatant, then we want somebody else to make sure that he's right. And that's what that court said. Hamdan, 2006 decision, where they struck down the president's ability to do military commissions under Article 2. They said, no, basically we want Congress to do it. That's why Congress passed the 2006 Military Commissions Act. And then Bowman went back to the Supreme Court and said, wait a minute, it's illegal. You can't detain me. And in that case, bitterly divided court 5-4, they said, yeah, you can. But you do have the right to a federal judge to check the math, look over the president's shoulder, and if you're not an unlawful enemy combatant, then they have to release you. If you are, they can keep you indefinitely. Does that mean 100 years? Yeah. Do I have a problem with that? No. I've been to Gitmo. They've got the worst of the worst down there right now. We've rehabilitated about 500 out of Gitmo, and imagine that, about 25% of them lied to us. and they really weren't rehabilitated. The folks down there right now, they don't play that game like it wasn't me, it was some guy. I'm going to kill you, let me out of here. And we've only got really evidence to prosecute about 60 by military commissions. The rest of them, we don't have enough evidence to try them by military commissions, but we're detaining them indefinitely until the war's over. Who tells us when the war's over? One of the three branches of government. So we are at war. I've just set the premise. Bam, I've won the debate. And my opponent, if you go to our website, you can see her response. She got out the violin, what they all do, and gave the sad story about so-and-so that we got the wrong guy. You know, some anecdotal story, which is fine. I had a friend of mine lost both legs in Grenada. Friendly fire. Did we mean to do it? No. It's not a perfect world. But legally, the framework is there. So we're using the law of war toolbox, not domestic criminal law toolbox. And Hayes is correct. What if Osama bin Laden did not have a gun with him? Could you shoot him down? Yeah. And I'm sure the team was briefed by their legal advisor. If he puts up his hands, the law of war says you cannot shoot them unless they're making a furtive move. But if he puts up his hands to surrender, then you would have to accept that surrender. But that's when you want to kill them, is when they're sleeping, when they're not looking, when they're going to the bathroom. The worst time to kill an enemy combatant is when they're shooting back at you because you might get shot. I had a case, our Center for Terrorism Law in 2006. This is stranger than fiction. Captain Staffel, Dave Staffel, Green Beret officer in Afghanistan. Him and his master sergeant up on a hill. They got information that a jihadist was going to attack a convoy and kill people. And it was the right guy. They had their interpreter go down the hill. The bad guy came out waving his hands very excitedly, and Staffel gave the order. They blew his brains out. Good kill. CID went down and said, yep, it's the right bad guy, good kill. Well, the Taliban went to a neighboring village and said, the Green Berets have murdered a village elder, a general officer back in this country without any documentation, preferred murder charges against these two heroes. Murder charges. Because under domestic criminal law, you can't do that. So I found out about it, called his lawyer, and of course we don't charge anything at our center, pro bono. I did a detailed affidavit to the 32 officer, which is the grand jury, and said, this is the law of war, this is a good kill, these guys are heroes. And Staffel said as soon as the 32 officer read my affidavit, bam, stopped it, recommend dismissal of all the charges. But that's how schizophrenic this country is. This is what Rebecca West, this is a simple truth. We are at war. Now we definitely need a commander-in-chief that tells us this more often. We need an attorney general that stops playing politics, in my opinion, about this issue and understands that military commissions are not a wrong thing to use. If they're unlawful enemy combatants, you use the law of war toolbox. If they're not, then you have to use domestic criminal law. And that's the point. We need clarity. We need legal clarity. That's why I'm very happy to be part of this panel, because we're trying to develop legal clarity, and these are some of the best and brightest folks in the country that try to push that forward. So thank you very much. I await your questions. I didn't even get the yellow flag.
Actually, I want to be out of business, Jeff. I think the panel, we should commend the panel for keeping the time. Honestly, it triggered a lot of issues. Since we have a little bit of time, why don't we do this? Let's start with you, Bob, and see if you want to make any comment or footnote to what some of the others were saying. And so each one will have 2 minutes, and then we'll open it up, okay?
All right, I do a fair amount of this, and I guess I've probably been on 50 or so panels since 911, maybe more than that, and I can't remember any where you've given 2 minutes to say what I think was wrong in some of the other presentations. I would have just said amen, but I don't think I heard a word with which I would disagree. I might add to Jeff's comment about using military commissions that if the Al-Qaeda detainees were prisoners of war, under the Third Geneva Convention, it would be a violation of international law to try them in domestic federal district court. The Geneva Conventions require that POWs be tried by military courts. It seems like nobody's ever read the Geneva Conventions, but and of course detaining them for the duration of the war is well established in the law of armed conflict, law of but no, I did not hear a word I think that I would quarrel with, and I'll pass it on to Spike.
I would just say that, just in passing, that you've heard from both Jeff and Hayes about the law of armed conflict and why the law of war applies to all of this. Could this have been a law enforcement mission? Yes, it could have been. Would it have made sense? Not really. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, that's wonderful. General Gray, would you like to?
Yeah.
Not yet?
Yeah, give the troops a chance to
Okay,
get into this.
okay. All right, fine. First, let's start from the back. Just stand up. Your name, affiliation, and question.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. What about Gaddafi? What about Gaddafi? The administration has said we are not. So why the logic you just used with the logic of Gaddafi?
Yeah, the question was, what about Gaddafi? The administration says we're not at war. What do we do about Gaddafi? I think there are two issues here. I'm not sure which one or if either you wanted to address. But one of them is, can we kill him? And the answer, I think, is absolutely clear, yes. Under Security Council Resolution 1973, the Security Council authorized the use of force by the coalition, virtually any member of the UN that wants to contribute, and it placed conditions. The condition was, you cannot occupy Libya. No conditions about who you target. Obviously, international law, the jus in bello, places other conditions. You cannot attack hospitals, you cannot attack orphanages that are not being used for military, there are an awful lot of illegal targets. You can't use poison gas, you can't use chemical warfare, and so forth. But international law says basically if you're going to use lethal force, it has to be necessary and proportional. Necessary means if you say cut it out and he'll cut it out, you're not allowed to kill him. But we said cut it out a lot of times, and he didn't cut it out. Proportional, to me, means if you have the choice between taking out Gaddafi with a cruise missile or one of those wonderful 50 caliber sniper rifles that, what was it, it was something like 4,000 meters, they took one out, and what's the record on that?
2,200.
2,200 meters? That's still long enough, it's over a mile. Or the alternative is waiting weeks or months while his soldiers continue to murder innocent civilians, and those soldiers themselves die. To me, the proportionality argument is, and also the moral argument is, you go after the main wrongdoer. You don't go after the maybe draftees that don't have the option of going to Canada, like some of my contemporaries did during Vietnam. So he's a lawful target. There's another question on that that's been in the news, the war powers debate. In fact, I just did a debate with Congressman Kucinich on Democracy Now! It was kind of fun. He's not real good on the Constitution, but the issue was, did the President need authority from Congress? And we could spend a whole program on that issue. But one thing I would note, when the Senate consented to the ratification of the UN Charter in 1945, and when the House and Senate enacted the UN Participation Act, the unanimous view expressed in both the House and Senate reports was that use of military force pursuant to Security Council authorization was not an act of war, but was a use of force for keeping the peace, and thus did not affect the power of Congress to declare war. Indeed, on December, I want to say 5th maybe, the first week of December, Senator Burton Wheeler, an isolationist from Montana, introduced an amendment that said the President shall have no authority to use U.S. military forces to carry out a Chapter 7 decision by the Security Council unless Congress has, by statute or joint resolution, authorized the use of force in the particular situation the UN has approved the use of force. He couldn't get 10 votes. It was defeated more than 7-1, and the bipartisan leadership said, this is inconsistent with the obligations we've already accepted of the UN Charter. So certainly the legislators who approved the UN Charter and the UN Participation Act overwhelmingly believed the President would carry out our obligations. Now remember, the President in Article 2 has the duty to see the laws faithfully executed. Laws, as the Supremacy Clause tells us, are this Constitution, laws made pursuant to the Constitution, and treaties made under the authority of the United States. So by by consenting to the ratification of a treaty, the President was empowered to carry out our obligations under the UN Charter. And so my own sense, but since Obama says the War Powers Resolution is lawful and it's later in time, and a statute later in time to a treaty takes precedent under U.S. law, it seems to me Obama's got two choices. He either says, well, wait a minute, we're using Predator drones to kill individuals in this conflict. The War Powers Resolution says it applies if we're involved in coordinating military use of force by other countries. Obviously, if it's lawful, it applies, and it trumps the charter for domestic law. So to me, Obama has two choices. Cut out what he's doing, or do what his every president since Richard Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, all of them have said the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. In 2008, the unanimous bipartisan National War Powers Commission, including Lee Hamilton, former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, unanimously concluded the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional and should be repealed. That, to me, is the solution. Obama is in a dilemma. His easy out is to agree with the War Powers Commission and every president since Nixon and say, this is not law. As John Marshall told us in Marbury versus Madison, an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is not law. Easy answer. That's more than you wanted to hear, but anyway, that is what it is.
Well,
anybody else?
yeah, maybe some other members
I have a different approach. I think, obviously, the president is not leveling with the American people. He's telling us this is not a war, not hostilities. That's his out. He said, hey, this is not hostility.
We're not involved in
Yeah,
hostility.
this is a kinetic military action. And then he also said, we're not taking sides. When you're trying to kill the leader of one side, you're taking sides. We're there to protect civilians. We kill civilians in our attacks, NATO's attacks. They kill, so that's collateral damage. I mean, we're not intentionally targeting civilians, so we're killing civilians. I think the president needs to provide more guidance about what we want to do. But again, many people are upset with us because the broad language of the Security Council resolution was to set up no-fly zones, and like we did in Iraq. And many people say, well, you're going way beyond the no-fly zones because I don't think any Libyan aircraft went up in the air. The only aircraft that went up was a rebel who had defected and he was shot down by other rebels. And the civilians out, the so-called civilians, these civilians, a lot of them are armed and heavily armed, shooting at civilians associated with the Gaddafi side. So it's truly a civil war, if you will, in the country. The United States has not been attacked. We can't invoke Article 51. The only legal authority we really have is the Security Council resolution. I think it's very weak. We're stretching that and as far as we possibly can and say, okay, command and control, therefore that means if we can't hit the aircraft carriers or sonar sites or radar sites, we're going to go for the leader. I just think we need to, when we go to war, and I think it is a war, they're shooting at us and we're shooting at them, and then of course NATO, without us there is no NATO. I mean, that's a fiction. We're a support role. We are the main role. That's not true. I like the transparency promise. I want to see some transparency. I want straight talk. We're not getting straight talk.
As a technical point, while it is true, the resolution 1973 was often described as a no-fly zone, the actual language was much broader than that. It did authorize what's going on.
It's broader, but that wasn't really put out to people. It's like our resolution for the campaign in Iraq, where the UN Security Council said serious consequences will follow. Well, we interpreted that to mean, war. Other nations said, oh no, we just interpret that to be another Security Council resolution. Well, we've done it. Right, let's do another.
Okay, anyone else? No? We have so many questions, so let's move on. Professor Fritter, back here.
I'm a professor of engineering and I know how to count. But when I cannot count all the jihadist organizations which are around, we are in war with, quote, Al-Qaeda. What about all the other organizations? Are we authorized to act against them? That's stupid.
The authorization was, as the president determines, those countries, organizations, or individuals responsible for the 9/11 attacks, and their allies, I think, or those associated with them. It's not a great reach for me to say Al-Qaeda is number one on the list. If today another jihadist organization is working with Al-Qaeda, they just became a target. Somebody can go into court and say, no, they weren't mentioned, or we didn't know, they weren't created for another 3 years. We'll argue that one out, but my own sense is if they're playing on Al-Qaeda's team in the game, we're going to knock them down.
Okay, please,
Let
Ace?
me add to
Right.
that, because,
Can you speak louder a little
yes,
bit?
Al-Qaeda is not that precise itself.
Yep.
There are a lot of Al-Qaeda franchises. Now, we're working in a number of nations. The Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Army all have foreign internal defense programs going on in any number of countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Philippines, any number of other places where they're assisting the local governments and their military in preparing to defeat any type of threat they may have on any type of the Al-Qaeda franchises. That's another aspect of this conflict. I use the term transnational terrorism because Al-Qaeda is not stupid. They don't stay in Afghanistan where we can attack them. They move elsewhere. The fact that they have moved to Yemen doesn't mean they can't be attacked. Or if they create a new franchise someplace else, doesn't mean they can't be attacked. So I agree with Jeff, a war against Al-Qaeda, but the term, as I said, the term is transnational terrorism. If they have some affiliation with, and I think that's the term that Secretary Gates, former Secretary Gates has used, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, to show that this is going to be a broader kinetic energy operation than some might have anticipated originally.
Let me just pick up on that. There's a lot of debate among international lawyers. Oh, no, you can't attack them away from the battlefield. And the battlefield must be just Afghanistan and so forth. And it's absurd. First of all, the battlefield included New York City unless you were swept through 9/11. But historically, you go after the enemy wherever the enemy goes. World War II, FDR didn't go back to Congress and say, hey, Rommel's in North Africa, I need another declaration of war. No, he went after the enemy forces where they were. And if Al-Qaeda operatives are in any country, obviously, if they're in a friendly country, we're not going to bomb France. We're not talking to the French government first. There are there are state responsibility issues. But the idea they go into Yemen or Somalia, to talk about a country that is totally dysfunctional, that does not immunize them from attack. You attack the enemy wherever you find them.
But the premise, also to answer your question, in the United States domestically, this is a problem because they don't have dog tags. They don't carry an ID card. I'm Al-Qaeda. So in the United States, if you have an Al-Qaeda member, and I've worked with the FBI, and I know Spike obviously is the source of authority here, but we tell the agents that you use domestic criminal law. And then, like Al-Mutalib, that's our first approach is whoever that person is on our shores, we use domestic criminal law, even if they're full-fledged Al-Qaeda, and that's our approach. So you don't come up and say, okay, I know that guy's full-fledged Al-Qaeda, we're just going to shoot him down. No, you have to use the law of domestic criminal law. They have to exhibit deadly force, give them the opportunity to surrender. So we use that approach here until we learn otherwise, and then we make the determination if they're captured, should we detain them indefinitely, should we use military commissions, et cetera, et cetera.
Three pirates which were killed, they're not Al-Qaeda.
Let me come back to this because I think it's a very important point. Part of the problem originated with some of President Bush's original statements. We will find you wherever you are, track you down and kill you. I worked with the governments of 7 of our closest allies for the last 4 years, discussing where are we going to be carrying out military operations. Their great concern was you find one member who might even be suspected of being part of Al-Qaeda in another country, and because their law enforcement authorities have not responded quickly enough, we're going to send in a military team. We said that's ridiculous. Look at our track record. We had other members of those governments, and these were the senior legal officials from those governments, said if Al-Qaeda moves from Afghanistan to Yemen or to Somalia, you have to go back to the Security Council for another resolution. And we finally persuaded them that was incorrect. We also convinced them that we're not going around the world attacking some grandmother in Switzerland who's dropped money in the Al-Qaeda fund at some pub or something like that. That was the concern, I think, that from where it originated. But we've shown them, if there is a situation where a government cannot act or fails to act, as was the case with UBL, then we would carry out an attack there, our own military operation. That's perfectly consistent with international law. On the other hand, if other governments are doing their job, it's not our job to go in and do that.
We have many people. I'm going to ask again the general.
A few more.
Anyone else? Okay. Obviously, we can complicate this much more. Many of the answers are in this book, as I said, in the new publication. But at every general, I know your time is limited, but
First, of course, I want to thank the panel for a great session. Just, of course, we expected that. It's your first-class group, and you know that. And thank you all for sharing some time with us this afternoon. I think that the issues here are really vital for all of us to really understand. And the reason that we have to understand these kind of things is that somehow, some way, we've got to help, along with legions of others, I guess, but we've got to help educate the American people about what this is all about, and what the stakes really are, and what price you have to pay sometimes to remain free, and understand clearly that you have to have freedom before you have liberty. And these are all very important thoughts, and we don't give enough time to it. One group that was not mentioned today by any of you is the media, and how that plays into this and what we have to do here. And in no particular priority, I think, for example, in my own view, we made a hero out of bin Laden. We talked about him, all the time, not just the media, but everybody talked about bin Laden and what he did and this and that, and we made him a folk hero around the world. And if you don't think that's true, go to some of these other countries and talk to some of these other young people who are by religion, who are Islam people, and who are taking their, getting their education through the mullah every Friday night and that kind of thing. They'll tell you, for example, in Indonesia, they'll tell you right up front that that 9/11 was a U.S. hoax. That 9/11 was really done by CIA operatives and others, and not by Al-Qaeda. And they believe it. And these are good people. These are good young people, like some of the young people we have here. So we've got a major kind of an understanding that we have to wrap our arms around in this country, and we have to have some kind of long-term campaign plan to turn this around and get the truth out in front of not just the American people, but in front of the world. And we have a lot of allies and friends, and they can help us. We don't have to go it alone. But we have to understand the seriousness of this of this issue. And we did the same thing with Noriega in Panama, and that was mentioned by one of our speakers. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when Panama went down, we were very careful at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level not to make Noriega a target. There were 4 principal missions for the people to go down there, and we laid that out very well, and we did not make Noriega a target. And lo and behold, when we had the big meeting in front of the Pentagon, Colin Powell and I were sitting alongside of each other, and the President was there, and lo and behold, there was a 5th mission announced. And that was, of course, we were going to get bin Laden. Now that's ridiculous, because that took the Panama mission and it changed it around to success or failure. You succeed only if you get Noriega. And we had to wait, as was brought out. We had to take a lot of extra time there looking around, and we were a little bit lucky there in the end, and we nailed it. And then, of course, we had the added expense of the trial and all that kind of thing, instead of shooting them in the leg and watch them roll around the ground and get rid of them. But that's the kind of thing you have to be careful about when you have all these legal people here. The point I want to make is that we should be very careful making folk heroes out of these people and cult heroes. It's just the less we say about bin Laden and the rest of them, the better off we are. And every time something happens, we have we have to have an investigation. When is the last time that you can remember in our country where when something went down, we didn't have a big congressional investigation? Every time. It seems to be the thing we do. And so we investigate ourselves, we open it all up, and I'm looking here at my former friend from the old intelligence days, like we open it all up and we tell everybody everything that we do, and we also tell everybody a good bit of our tradecraft along the way. That's criminal. And what we ought to do is take a couple of these people who have openly given away some of our tradecraft and lock them up and fine them. That's what, when I was a youngster in the intelligence business a million years ago, if you inadvertently gave some information that was classified, man, you were fined $10,000 right on the spot. And so we've gotten away from that. We've gotten away from the self-discipline that's needed as a nation. We like to talk. We talk too much, way, way, way too much. And so that bothers me. And I don't think you don't want to declare war with the media. In my judgment, over time, it's much better to work with them, even though sometimes they can really frustrate you when you're in this position. When I was, 44 years ago this spring, I was the commander of all the Free World Forces at the outpost at Jilin in South Vietnam. And that was where they were building the famous McNamara Trace and all that kind of thing. And it was, militarily, it was one of the dumbest ideas that we've ever accepted. It was absolutely ludicrous. And my Marines, and I had also about 500 soldiers under me at that time, and the soldiers and Marines used to bet when we would build a tower, and we had the engineers up there, and we'd build a tower, and we would bet on how long before the Viet Cong would burn it down. I mean, and that kind of thing. So it was a ridiculous kind of a concept, but we bought into it as a nation, and we tried to execute it. But the point I want to make was while we were there, all of a sudden we got the word from Saigon that there was a huge group of refugees coming down from the north, and they were going to cross the DMZ, and we were the closest unit to it, and we were to stop them at all costs. We were not to allow these refugees to come into South Vietnam. And so what are you going to do? What would you do? You're a young major and all that kind of thing. You're brought up like all good people in America are. You're not going to be like the Germans were in World War II. If there's a terrorist act in some town or village, you line up 1,000 locals and shoot them. You weren't brought up that way. And I had a good friend of mine was the ARVN commander, the South Vietnamese commander. We had fought together before 3 or 4 years ago, and he was a very brave commander and a good one. And so we took some of his people and some of my people, and we went down to the bridge that separates the two Vietnams at the time, and watched these people come across. And I remembered from Korea. I was there when in Korea we had a lot of refugees come down. And every fourth or fifth one was a North Korean soldier with burp guns, and we lost a lot of people because of that. So all that goes through your mind, and you're wondering, what are you going to do? And of course, you have the usual rinky-dink rules of engagement, which ought to be abolished. The average American warrior knows what the hell to do in combat. He doesn't need any rules of engagement or anything else like that. That's all cover your rear end kind of stuff. But anyway, that's another topic. And so they came on down, and we looked at them, and so we decided on the spot to ignore the orders that we got from Saigon. And we let the refugees come on through. They turned out to be several thousand North Vietnamese Catholics, for the main, who were shipped down by the North Vietnamese communists, and they went on down south another 15 or so miles. We built refugee camps for them, and those people lived to have another day. But that's the kind of thing that your military people deal with all the time. And it's not easy, and it's not supposed to be easy. And you have to make tough decisions, and you try to make them the best way that you know how. And that's what our people did, and that's what I think they did on the raid that took care of bin Laden. I think that the question about the other terrorist organizations is is crucial, and we need to understand that it's not just Al-Qaeda. In fact, it may have been better, Jeff, to have said, at least now we got something Al-Qaeda and all, but I would rather see it even broader yet, because there are other organizations out there. There have been other organizations for many, many, many years. And if you track this kind of terrorist type activity and so on for the last 100 years, and so like Yona and others have done, you can understand that. And so we need to clearly understand that these people, these radical people, for whatever reason, are convinced that they're right and we're wrong. And they're going to get us one way or the other. And so we've got to get smart. We've got to get street smart. We've got to learn to play the what-if game. We ought to be always on the alert. And when we see something that's not right, we ought to report it. And if we see something that's immediately dangerous, we ought to take it out and talk about it later. I mean, that's the way we're going to have to be. And I just think that these kinds of seminars are superb because they help give us some facts that we in turn can communicate to our brethren and to our friends around the world. But make no mistake, this is a very, very serious time. It's a difficult time. And it's not just a matter of military operations. It's not just a matter of law enforcement. It's a matter of everybody really working together, sharing information, sharing knowledge, sharing experience, and getting on with it. And with that, I think, Yona, you made me talk earlier. You want me to get out of here now or what?
No, no.
Well, I want to thank the panel again for a superb presentation.
Thank you very much, General.
Okay.
Now we'll turn again. Okay, let's continue. There are a few more questions.
Can I just make one comment? So you won't understand this. I said earlier when I started that having known the general, I was surprised to see him promoted up to 4-star rank and made commandant. Now, that may make no sense to you now, but all I can say is when I knew him, he was much more controversial and
Don't pay attention. Okay, Mark Kraft from State Department, please.
Thanks very much. And Bob, I've known you for years. You're as persuasive as usual.
not bad.
No, I agree with you. But I had a question that Professor Parks raised. We talked about affiliates of Al-Qaeda. One of the major problems now is the so-called lone wolves, the self-starters who their only connection may be basically internet influence. How do you think the law applies in these cases where there's no evidence that they've had any direct contact with Al-Qaeda, but are influenced either individually or perhaps a small cell, purely by the internet and other propaganda? And a question for Mr. Bowman, Spike. I was wondering, as you may recall, the issue of the emphasis on the criminal law goes back to the Reagan administration. In fact, I was brought in the State Department to help develop a public diplomacy program that Schultz wanted to start to emphasize that terrorist is a crime. And so that emphasis and the buildup of the many laws comes from there. Are you concerned at all that this aspect is being overshadowed and the usefulness of the civilian law by all the emphasis on the military side? Where do you think the dividing line is?
The question you asked deals with the issue of whether or not that person is taking direct part in hostilities. If it's a domestic issue, obviously it would be an FBI issue. If it's outside the United States and this person is participating, as you've suggested, in some sort of individual capacity or as a cell, if you were using purely law of war formula only as to whether or not he could be targeted, there are a couple of things. Is what he is doing some sort of material support to Al-Qaeda operations? And second, is it a continuous function? If he does something, every 3 months, one thing. If he does it more regularly, then it might be another. I stick with the premise, though, that we're talking about places where it would be necessary for us to target him rather than the local government authorities to actually apprehend and or target him. We're not going to run around the world killing everybody. And that's the controversy that I said was stirred up in our discussion with the 7 other governments. They were very concerned that, as I said, just because the little lady puts the dollar or the Swiss franc into a box someplace in a bar in Switzerland, we're going to go up and knock her off, knock the kicks. Maybe 5 francs, maybe, but not.
Euros.
No, Switzerland doesn't have euros. Swiss francs. But ironically, that is part of it. what exactly does this person contribute? Is it some material that would induce us to consider targeting him if the local government fails to do that? We had this issue in Afghanistan, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this, with regard to the people who were the drug dealers, the drug merchants in Afghanistan. They were contributing major funding to both Al-Qaeda and to the Taliban. I can only say that that resulted in some very lengthy interagency discussions as to whether or not that was material support and continuous support. And I won't tell you all the answers to it, but it's the kind of thing that is a sticking point. The formula is there. The formula is not that precise, and it's hard to find that precise line.
Well, it's also the prosecute or extradite basis of the
If you're on that side, yeah, I'm talking only the purely targeting side. Obviously, if someone is in fact a drug dealer or a drug merchant, growing, distributing, selling, raising money for Al-Qaeda, is that someone we would try to capture and remove the United States for prosecution? In Afghanistan, that's not against the law. It's against the law for Muslims to use it, but it's not against the law for Muslims to sell drugs for infidels to use. That's us. So that's the kind of dilemma we had on that.
Anyone else on this point? Okay, let's, Spike, you want?
Yeah, well, just to answer your question, I'm not at all concerned that law enforcement has taken a backseat to law of armed conflict issues in this. In fact, although it's been sort of a painful growing process on both sides, law enforcement and the military have been working together very symbiotically for now quite some period of time. There is a terrorist explosive device analysis center down at Quantico, which is run by the FBI, ATF, and the Army. And using the analysis, the forensic analysis that we've got there, and bringing in things that the military picks up on the battlefield, we've identified any number of bomb makers by name, at least 25 of whom have been picked up because of working together there. We have the military has adopted the FBI's mechanisms for fingerprinting and have got their own database now for fingerprinting, which is only just short of what the FBI has available. We've been teaching the military now for well over a decade how to exploit the things that they find on the battlefield, the pocket litter they find when they pick up people at checkpoints and so forth. So actually the abilities of both the military and the law enforcement have been sharpened considerably by being able to work together.
Great. Okay, we have this gentleman there, please. Speak louder if you can.
Hi. Actually, this question is for Hayes. In your article on the use of... I'm sorry, Scott Schwieger, Department of Defense. In your article on the use of Special Operations Forces wearing civilian clothes when moving to a battlefield, you said that there was, if I recall correctly, that there was no problem with that because they're not engaging in hostilities and therefore not in any sort of perfidy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I like that. That's good. So if when they resume their military clothing, they regain, I guess, their privileged belligerency. Is there any, in your view, is there any impact on that privilege for modifying one of the other four factors in determining the privilege of belligerent, insofar as having a non-military person in a chain of command in any given operation? Which is to say, I've seen a lot of Schwarzenegger movies where he has, as a member of the military, been subject to other organizations' command and control. If he was subject to another organization's command and control, not the military, would that affect his belligerence, or his privilege?
I think I'd prefer not to answer that, simply because we're getting into one of the really gray areas of the law. If a civilian accompanies the military in armed conflict, he is entitled, or she is entitled to prisoner of war protection if captured. Now, I don't like to do the analogy of this civilian doing this because we have private security contractors on the battlefield who have a right of self-defense and who will wear civilian clothing because they're not authorized to wear uniforms. On the other hand, you're talking special operations forces wearing non-standard uniforms, which is not civilian clothing. They can be. In my article, you'll recall, I refer to the special operations forces who initially went in post 9/11 into Afghanistan to work with the Northern Alliance. They put on Northern Alliance attire for a very simple reason. If you stand up there as a sole guy and U.S. BDUs, you're called by the other side a high-value target. We weren't the first ones to think this up. Lawrence of Arabia thought about this because he was with the British captain working in Syria in World War I. When the British captain insisted on wearing his dress uniform on the battlefield, he was shot the first day. So Lawrence of Arabia went into the local attire for these heavily armed groups, which it's kind of a clue when 200 dudes on their horses or camels with guns that they're not exactly going to the grocery store. So there's no perfidy there. That's the whole issue. The same thing, if you have a civilian who has otherwise somehow been attached to your military unit, and he is attired the same way you are, so he will not be identified as what he is, there's no issue of perfidy there. In fact, if you go to many parts of the world, I think General Gray has probably seen this, you can actually tell what tribe a person is from by the way they walk. So the idea that, okay, I could not go to Vietnam and say, I'm just another Vietnamese. There's several clues there that give that away. And it's just the same is true there. So you have to look at things more than what are they wearing, who are they with. But the question is, ultimately, is that person engaged in something would be fitness? And they would be prohibited. But as a general rule, I hate to say, because there's so many, as I said, so many different variants there that could come up.
Okay. This young lady here.
Yes, hi, Adrian LaPointe, CSIS. Thanks. So I wonder if you could explain to me what makes an enemy combatant unlawful, and whether there's a difference between a lawful and unlawful combatant, and whether it affects how we treat them.
That's a really easy one. Thank you for asking. It was a setup, you know. All right. In the 1949 Geneva Prison War Convention, it actually codifies something that's been around for 800 years, this idea of combatant's privilege. If you are representing a government in an armed conflict as a uniformed member of that government, you are a combatant and you enjoy the combatant's privilege, except if you're military, medical personnel, or chaplains. In Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the 1949 Geneva Convention, it basically says all members of the military, the regular military, are in fact entitled to prison force status. That gives them combatant status as well. The tricky part comes in Article 4A2, because many people misread it to think there are only 4 criteria. There are in fact 7. So when you're talking about a private armed group, a non-state actor, as we oftentimes call it, and you have someone like an Al-Qaeda operative. First, there does have to be an international armed conflict. At the time Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center, we did not have an international armed conflict with Al-Qaeda. They were not a nation state, as has been pointed out here. But then you get into Article 4A2 itself. It was written as a basis of our experience in World War II, supporting, through the OSS and the British Special Operations Executive, supporting resistance groups in Axis-occupied territories. So it was rewritten to conform that, to say, other persons entitled to prisoner of war status include members of an organized resistance group. That has to be one, that's the first criteria. The second criteria, it has to be one authorized by a government. The various groups that acted in resistance against the Axis in World War II were in fact operating on the basis of the governments that had been exiled primarily to the United Kingdom. Then you get into the 4 traditional criteria, wearing some sort of device. Uniform is not defined anywhere in the treaties. It could be a hat, it could be an armband, something. Carrying their arms openly, abiding by the law of war, and under someone's command. And those are the criteria for those resistance groups. But again, that gives them the combatant's privilege.
Now, many people, including people in the Bush administration, right off the bat said Al-Qaeda is not they're not lawful combatants because they don't meet the 4 criteria. They didn't meet any of the 7 criteria whatsoever. So what if Al-Qaeda put on an armband the day they carried out the attack? Obviously, you could say, okay, now we have it. That gives them prisoner of war status. It does not necessarily give them combatant's privilege. The combatant's privilege is restricted to government authorized, either military or government authorized resistance groups that meet the criteria in Article 4A2. That's the distinction that many failed to meet in the initial days after 9/11. It's a concept from the just war theory of right authority. Right authority exists with nation states and their governments, not with private individuals. That's the thing that's been missed most by me.
So basically, though, that concept fails to take into account the declaration of war against a non-state actor, doesn't it? Because
well,
you've got combatants who are illegal, and yet you declare war on them.
Well, we don't, as Jeff pointed out, we don't declare war. We've only done it 5 times in our history. The last time we did it was December 8, 1941. The last declaration of war anywhere in the world was by the Soviet Union against Japan in the closing days of World War II. And many scholars and many non-scholars will tell you that because of Article 51 of the UN Charter, nobody declares war anymore. Even though Congress is not required to declare war. Congress simply has the authority to declare war if they choose. They somehow decided they don't want to anymore. Cowards. But anyway, so that's it.
Okay, we have one more question about you.
Yeah, I'll from the Zionist Organization of America. You guys have been very effective at answering the question about bin Laden, but I'm still not really clear on where the lines are. I think it's clear from your answers that in the Middle East, for example, targeted killings of Hamas leadership are probably in a similar category. But where is the dividing line? It sounds like Al-Qaeda could kill President of France tomorrow and be within those guidelines. What about killing Noriega, or in Venezuela, the leader of a government that's cooperating with our enemies, but not that we're clearly not at war with? Where are the actual borderlines? Where can you say some examples of things that would not be a legitimate exercise of killing a leader of enemies?
Just because we don't like somebody doesn't mean we have the right to kill them. I mean, this goes back to our things already discussed. Article 51 of the UN Charter. I don't want to delve into the issues of Hamas and Hezbollah, and I'm glad nobody has raised the targeted killing decision by the Israeli Supreme Court, which I think really is unique to the experience that Israel has, the threats it has. I don't think that's something that can be translated and placed someplace else. We go through the same factors. I should go back and say, remember, people like Al-Qaeda, some of these other private groups, do not have right authority. So they don't have authority to go attack the President of France or anyone else. There has oftentimes been, even in war, a certain comity between nations that the national leaders will not be targeted because you want someone to negotiate with to end the conflict. At the same time, both Germany and the United Kingdom tried to target each other's leaders during World War II. If someone is in fact in an international armed conflict with another nation state, and that national leader is part of the command and control mechanism, they can be attacked. In England, who is that? The Queen? Why?
Why not?
Yeah, why not? She's the titular head. She is not the head of state conducting or directing military operations. Who has that responsibility? Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister could be attacked. Just as when this all came up in the issue of assassination 20 years ago, we said someone who is a head of state can be attacked in wartime. The first people will say, God, don't write that out. It was the Secret Service. But it's feeding the office. But so if you look at this issue of direct participation in hostilities, you are looking at what is this person doing? What is their role? Are they continuous, as was the case with UBL? Are they providing material support of some sort? There's a formula there, but it's kind of squishy. And then you also can get into the politics, interagency politics. We really want to do that. And then we come back to the question General Gray raised. I think the reason the Air Force Chief of Staff got fired during Desert Shield, as I think Bobby brought this up, was because you don't signal who you're going to go attack. In fact, we had the experience in 1989, 1990 with Noriega that suddenly someone says in 1991 when Iraq went into Kuwait, now we're going to target Saddam Hussein. I envisioned Saddam Hussein had a Winnebago. Have you seen the Chevy Chase movies, European Vacation, all that? I saw, okay, Europe, Middle Eastern vacation, Chevy Chase in a Winnebago with people hitting every Winnebago that drives down the road in Iraq during this time because they're trying to find. It's the thing you don't telegraph your punches, basically. So we oftentimes say, no, we're not doing that. What we're making anyway.
Okay, we'll give you a chance before we end our session today to make just comments about anything you want to say at this point. I know you can give a course on this.
I've never seen such a love fest. I'm trying to figure out how it happened, and finally I realized I was the one that picked the panel.
Well, I mean, you know, it's very rare to have a consensus with international lawyers. But at any rate, we're going to end this thing in 1 second. I'm delighted that you kept to the time. Before we end, let me thank Laurie Kenny right here for taping this thing. And, you know, if they get up in the middle of the night, can they watch it on the website of the Potomac?
This will be on our website this evening.
Wonderful. That's great. Number one. Number two, I would like to thank our young interns right here for their contribution. Believe it or not, we have 5 law students right here who came to work with us, so there was 4 and maybe these. But at any rate, this is the future scholars and generations and so on. We're very, very proud of them. Now, because you have done such a great job, and obviously we know it's not the end of scholarship, but the beginning of scholarship, of continuation of scholarship, what we would like to do is to give each and every one of you a copy of this publication, and certainly I would like to get your comments or criticism once you have a chance to look at it. So we want to thank you again for your contribution. We want to thank the audience for your involvement. Sorry?
One last thing.
Okay.
Let's say thank you to Yona for doing all the things he did.
So that's what I usually do to close it out.
I'm sorry?
No, one thought and one quote from General Gray. General William Tecumseh Sherman's U.S. Civil War fame said that war is cruelty. There's no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. Maybe that holds true today. General Gray, who I've gotten to know better since I retired and hang around here with him, says, if you do what's right, it's usually legal. Now, this is a complicated subject, and I'm just your average American Joe, I think, more than anything else. And I always hear all the legal opinion. That gets lost in me. But when General Gray has hammered that home to me, let's do what's right. It's probably legal. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
You have a comment.
Yes, I do.
Yes, sir. Good to see you.
You know, I don't always agree with you.
Mary, you want